The Golden Eagle figurehead of USS Lancaster is the first artifact you see upon entering the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. It's beautiful. Frankly, it is giant. And along with 4 of USS Lancaster's main battery guns, it's a memorial, if you will, to a ship which was in some ways the last ship designed and built for the old steam navy, the old wooden-hulled navy of the 19th century. Now, if you read the Wikipedia page for USS Lancaster, you'll find that she was built at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in the late 1850s. She was commissioned in May of 1859. She was the near sister of some of the Navy's most famous ships of the American Civil War, USS Hartford, USS Richmond, USS Brooklyn, USS Pensacola. While those ships spent the war years very actively at New Orleans and near Vicksburg, Mobile Bay, other places, USS Lancaster in 1859 had been sent to the Pacific coast to be the flagship of the Pacific Squadron, and she served the Navy well during the war years. It's just not much happened on the Pacific coast of the United States. I guess had CSS Shenandoah ever made it all the way across the Pacific, maybe that would have changed, but USS Lancaster had quiet war years. She returned to the East Coast in 1867. USS Lancaster recommissioned in 1869 to serve as the flagship of the South Atlantic Station. She would spend most of the next 6 years off the Brazilian coast representing the interests of the United States before returning to Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1875. There she was laid up, and at that point she was in poor condition. Reports surveying the vessel found large portions of her frame had rotted. The annual report of the Secretary of the Navy for 1876 notes that the estimated cost of repairing Lancaster at this point was nearly $1 million, and it said that a new vessel of modern design could be built for less money. Not only would she have cost a lot of money to repair, but at this point the Navy really didn't need another 1850s designed steam sloop of war in the fleet. They needed more modern ships. And somewhat ironically, they had as a model for what they wanted a ship that's design had been inspired by Lancaster. USS Trenton had been built in the middle 1870s, was by far the most powerful ship in the U.S. Navy. She carried a battery of initially 11 8-inch rifles, and her hull form had been modeled, at least on part, on USS Lancaster's hull. What the Navy really wanted was another Trenton. And so, in the late 1870s, they began to build one under the guise of repairing Lancaster. The U.S. Navy received very little money from Congress for new construction, and so what the Navy did instead was use monies that were appropriated for repairing ships to repair them. Most egregiously, this had taken place starting in the early 1870s when 5 very different ships, one of them the former ironclad Galena, another a sailing vessel, 3 other steamships of very different sizes, had been rebuilt to be a class of 5 nearly identical steam sloops. The Navy was not above saying that they were pulling a vessel apart and reassembling it and replacing the rotten wood to just out and out build a new ship. And this sometimes muddies the identity between what was the old ship and what was the new ship. It's not entirely clear what happened to Lancaster. Lancaster, of course, had been a model for Trenton, and Trenton was the model for Lancaster's rebuilding. It's possible that some of the frame of Lancaster stayed together. It's possible that some of the wood was carried over, but what resulted was almost an entirely new ship. Whereas the old steam sloop had been much like Hartford and Brooklyn and Richmond, the new flagship USS Lancaster had a ram bow. It had bilge keels. Gone was the battery of 9-inch Dahlgren smoothbores of the 1850s, which were mounted on broadside carriages, which would have been familiar to the sailors of Nelson's day or the century before. They were replaced by a uniform main battery of 10 8-inch rifles. These 8-inch rifles, despite being a conversion of an 11-inch Dahlgren, were an effective weapon of at least the 1870s. The old 11-inch gun had been bored out and an 8-inch rifled sleeve inserted, locked to the cast iron at the muzzle with a ring, and it turned what had been a smoothbore gun into a rifle capable of firing a 180-pound shot with 35 pounds of powder. It could penetrate up to 7 inches of iron armor at 1,000 yards. Perhaps much more revolutionary were the carriages. Gone were the rope-hauled pivot carriages of old. Instead, these guns were mounted on carriages that the guns were run in and out and trained from side to side by gearing. They had hydraulic buffers. If you look at these carriages, they are very much a step in the progression of U.S. naval gun mounting design from the Civil War days to the new Navy that we'll see just a few years later in the mid-1880s. Lancaster was a powerful ship, or she would have been had she been given powerful engines. The engine she was given, which may have come from a ship built at the end of the Civil War but never completed, could only manage 9 knots. Trenton could at least do 12, maybe 14 at a stretch. But this is at a time that the fastest transatlantic liners could hold more than 15 knots all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. That's an average speed. Lancaster was simply slow. Too slow to matter in a world in which steamships were getting faster and faster. Lancaster, despite being slow, was still the second most powerful ship in the U.S. Navy after Trenton, and would for the rest of the 1880s be one of the Navy's most prestigious flagships. In July of 1882, she was witness to the British bombardment of Alexandria, Egypt. She had actually helped rescue American citizens ashore just before the bombardment, and in the aftermath send a landing party of Marines and sailors ashore to help fight fires. We get an insight into what life was like aboard USS Lancaster in the book Blue Jacket, an autobiography by Fred Bunzel. Bunzel served aboard Lancaster in the early 1890s when she was flagship of the Asiatic Squadron. His memories of Liberty calls in ports throughout Asia are as fond as his recollections of his officers are, well, not. But he gives the impression of a ship that very much still moves under sail at almost all times, using its engines only when absolutely necessary to move in and out of port to save on coal, which is carried in relatively limited quantities. USS Lancaster would continue to see service through the 1890s, including during the Spanish-American War. At the beginning of the 1900s, she began a short career as a training vessel before eventually becoming a quarantine ship. She was not broken up until 1933. The Golden Eagle figurehead has been part of the collection of the Mariners Museum in Newport News for decades. The Mariners Museum is fantastic, by the way. If you haven't been there, please go. It only costs $1 to go in. There's an incredible exhibit on USS Monitor. It's well worth your time. 4 of USS Lancaster's 8-inch rifles ended up at the Navy base in Charleston, South Carolina, where they spent decades at one of the base's gates. Around the year 2000, they were moved to Patriots Point, where they spent nearly 2 decades guarding USS Yorktown. Around 2022, they were moved to the soccer stadium at Patriots Point, which is the home of the team, the Charleston Battery, named after the battery at White Point Gardens, where the 11-inch Dahlgren of USS Keokuk is displayed. And I get that their presence at the soccer stadium is a link to the battery downtown, and for soccer fans, that's great. But they've begun to be the subject of more and more scratch graffiti among jubilant soccer fans. I know I care more than most about historic naval ordnance, but the 4 guns of USS Lancaster are on original carriages. There is no other display like this of U.S. Navy ordnance from the time period anywhere else in the world. I find USS Lancaster to be a fascinating ship because she and Trenton both represent this midpoint between the old steam Navy, which fought and won the American Civil War, and the new Navy that was built in steel and has become the Navy we had today. Lancaster and Trenton are kind of the missing link between them. And I take Lancaster to be a new ship built around 1880. She may have had fragments of the previous ship, but to me, she is the last wooden cruiser built for the U.S. Navy. And her artifacts, the Eagle and Newport News, the 4 guns at Patriots Point, are all worth maintaining and preserving. And frankly, I wish that the caretakers of them at Patriots Point would put a little bit more effort into them, or send them somewhere else where they can truly be appreciated for what they are. A unique example of the U.S. Navy in the 1880s, and a memorial to a fascinating ship and the sailors who sailed upon all of the U.S. Navy's ships at the end of the old steam navy. Hey, I'm Santee 1821. I tell stories of the U.S. Navy in the 19th century, look at surviving artifacts. Please follow me for more. Thank you.